like to take a minute and have some folks removed from the stage.
Boy, that was the scene of the Vancouver Board of Trade event earlier today. The pair of climate change protesters breezed past the RCMP, hopped on the stage inches from the Prime Minister, hauled away quickly. Well, eventually, I should say, by the police. The incident has raised serious questions about the PM's security detail. We had one of those protesters on the show, Mr. Devlin, the guy right behind the Prime Minister. He said, look, he simply impersonated a waiter, our catering staff, put on a black apron, and boom, he was on stage, no security check. The breach occurred as the PM kicks off a new year by trying to change the channel on the Senate scandal and focus on the economy. Is there really cause for optimism when it comes to the outlook for 2014, particularly when it comes to natural resources? And what about the PM's security? Does the RCMP detail need to be beefed up? Joining me now, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade, Erin O'Toole. Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year.
In Toronto, NDP finance critic Peggy Nash. Happy New Year to you. And finally, in Halifax, the Liberal finance critic Scott Bryson. Happy New Year to you all. And boy, I know a lot of Canadians dealing with the weather, and we've talked a lot about that. But the Prime Minister is trying to turn the page on what was a pretty rough year in a lot of ways for the Prime Minister. And he goes out west trying to talk about trade, and we'll talk about that. But Mr. O'Toole, what kind of security breach was it that a protester could walk up inches from the back of the Prime Minister without security touching him?
Well, look, I don't think anybody on all sides likes to see something like that, and hopefully there'll be lessons learned by the RCMP on the incident. But I think the Prime Minister himself summed it up best. You're not in BC unless there's a few protesters. I remember Mr. Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau, years ago had a very famous confrontation with protesters in British Columbia. So, look, you know, people should have the ability to express their opinion.
You're talking about the...
Well, way back, there was a famous
salute
by Pierre Trudeau. I think that was in BC. And so I think we've got to learn from that. People definitely have a right to their views and to challenge the government. That's the great parliamentary democracy we live in. But certainly that was concerning to be able to get that close to the PM. But fortunately, it was just a silent protest.
Let's talk about the issue. Obviously, the big issue, pipelines. One of them was Keystone. Here's what the Prime Minister had to say about the Keystone XL pipeline when he was asked.
President Obama has said no to Keystone.
No, he's punted.
He's fair.
Right.
Canadian Football League style.
He said maybe.
All right, so the Prime Minister said he's punted. He said maybe, but the Prime Minister has said he won't take no for an answer. Where does this stand now? I mean, what is the Prime Minister's position on Keystone?
I think our position has been consistent. We're really hoping the Americans make the right decision on Keystone. It's a win for both countries in terms of employment, but more importantly, the U.S., their own environmental authority has said that Keystone itself will have no measurable impact on greenhouse gas emissions, and in fact, it will actually be an economic boon and will replace a lot of refined oils coming to the U.S. by other countries that are less safe and secure than Canada.
The protesters and those that are against Keystone say clearly Keystone itself is a proxy issue for greenhouse gas emissions that they argue would go up due to increased rapid development of the oil sands. So they're linked inextricably. It's not the pipeline doesn't exist on its own. That's their argument. Does this force the Prime Minister to finally, you know, he's promised regulations on the oil and gas side? We haven't seen any year after year. We haven't seen any movement on a price on carbon or any issue on the carbon. Should the Prime Minister move more quickly to get these things done?
I think you're going to see both the federal government and the Albertan government moving towards more effective technology and regulation in terms of developing the resource in a responsible way.
Alberta's got a price on carbon. Would the feds consider it?
That's something that they've looked at in Alberta. I think what we really need to do is to make sure that the technology is there to harness that tremendous resource that all Canadians benefit from responsibly. You know, people still have the impression that they're doing the old open pit sort of digging approach in the oil sands. The steam-assisted gravity drainage, SAGD as it's called, is now the way that a lot of this is done in the ground itself. So the technology in the last 30 years has been incredible there. We've made government investments from the federal government in terms of trying to reduce the use of water, reduce the impact of on the environment. We've got to do more, and we've got to communicate what we have been doing to the U.S.
Okay, so let me get Peggy Nash on that issue. Is doing more on those issues, is that inextricably linked, in your view, to some kind of movement on Keystone and or Northern Gateway?
Well, first of all, Evan, let me just say on the unfortunate demonstration at the Prime Minister's speech today, I think that's what happens when you only talk to people you agree with and keep other people shut out. And that has branded our relations internationally when it comes to climate change and when it comes to exporting our oil resources. And it's, I think, the fact that this government has not taken any action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and it has, in fact, gone the other way. It has undermined our environmental regulations and certainly undermined public confidence in this government's ability to effectively reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That has undermined our trading relations when it comes to the oil industry. I think that failure to engage meaningfully with local people has undermined the Northern Gateway pipeline. I see that as something that people have just really dug in against and feel very strongly about. And with the Keystone XL pipeline, you know, this is a tremendous resource that we have here in Canada, but our international reputation, which is well-deserved, which is poor on environmental issues, as well as the export of so many processing jobs, undermines our export position.
Just a lot of people are confused a bit by the NDP position. And some critics would say, I don't understand the NDP. They support a pipeline going west-east. They're not sure if they support a pipeline going south. They're going to wait for the U.S. to decide that, but they don't support one going to the west. So is the NDP against pipelines or for pipelines? What is it?
We are, Evan, we are in favor of sustainable development. Our oil industry, like all our natural resources, are a tremendous benefit to Canada, but not when they sacrifice our environment with uncontrolled development and export. So what we should be doing is providing environmental safeguards, but at the same time maximizing the benefit that we get out of those resources. So let's maximize the number of jobs that we can get from developing our oil resources, but let's develop them in a way that is safe and that has strict environmental regulations. That doesn't exist in Canada today.
Evan, I think it's important to mention that the NDP has a conflicted position, but they also say a different thing when they go in the U.S. So they had MPs in Washington criticizing Canada, which was really unparalleled.
Let me bring in Scott Bryson, and we can have this. Hold on, Peggy Nash. Let me bring in Scott Bryson, because we got to be fair on time here. Mr. Bryson, your view on what the Prime Minister said about the pipelines going forward on those?
Well, first of all, on Keystone, that ought to have been a slam dunk. It's in Canadian interest and U.S. interest. But Mr. Harper has not built the kinds of relationships we need in Washington with the Obama administration to defend Canadian interests. He has not built the kinds of relationships that Mr. Chrétien had built, for instance, with Mr. Clinton, or that Prime Minister Mulroney had developed with President Reagan. Those relationships are essential, but whether it's dealing with our biggest trading partner in Washington, or working with provinces, or working with Aboriginal and First Nations people, the Prime Minister Harper does not play well with others, and this has been comes at a significant economic cost to Canada. And in terms of Northern Gateway, he has not worked with Aboriginal and First Nations people. He has not worked with community groups or the environmental communities. And he has been criticized even by former Minister Prentice for having failed to effectively engage Aboriginal and First Nations leadership. Again,
well, they have had the IFRD report, to be fair. Now, what about the IFRD report and that kind of engagement?
Well, there has been some engagement, but nobody has accused this Prime Minister of being effective in building strong relationships with the kinds of stakeholders that are required to move these important projects forward.
I got to leave it there. Aaron O'Toole, Scott Bryson, Peggy Nash, always good to have the three of you back.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Happy New Year.
Coming up, Is security around the Prime Minister too lax? That's the result of our ballot box question. You'll find out what it is next.